Hi, everyone, and welcome back to our psychology podcast. This month, Josh and I are going to talk about social media and specifically three main points. Why does one use social media? Why is social media addictive? And the correlation between social media and declining mental health. And today we are lucky enough to have Peter on, who's a teacher of psychology and a health psychologist. So, hi, Peter. Thank you for
Hello. Nice to be here.
So, just to start off with, why does one use social media? So let's just get into some stats. So in 2018, there was a study that showed people between the ages of 18 to 29, 88% of those people, use social media. Now, this is the age group where is a bit above adolescence, but should be enough that maybe they're using it less. So the fact that it's that high says a lot. The stat that gets me the most worried is that the people between 50 and 64 use it 64% of the time. 64% of that age group are using it. Now, this is an age group which didn't grow up using social media. So this is showing the complete effect. Agreed?
Yeah, I do completely agree, because there are
Yeah.
in the UK alone there are 45 million people that are registered on social media sites.
Yeah.
That's well in sort of like almost or above 2/3 of the population. So yes, a lot of adults are using these sites.
Yeah. I think what's important in trying to understand why we use social media, and this is specifically for adolescents, is obviously we grow up using that, but why do we use it so constantly? Now, I found some theories. One of them is a little bit out there, but I'm just going to say it. So someone linked Maslow's hierarchy of human needs to our want to use social media. So safety, having a safety net online where we can feel safe and have financial, mental, physical security, artificially, obviously, to have, validation and people that want you there, esteem. That's one way we could say this is we use it. But I think my opinion is that social media is basically a way to get a reward, and it's
but we don't always get that gratification when we enter onto social media. We don't always get that gratification. It's not a constant. It's not A plus B equals C. When you go on social media, it's kind of like you're pulling in a slot machine. You don't know the outcome.
Well, I think if you think about your knowledge of how reinforcement works, though, Josh, if that's true, and there's a variable reinforcement schedule on social media, that would actually make it even more compelling. So the uncertainty as to how many likes you're going to get, how a post is going to be received, that would be what we call an inconsistent schedule of reinforcement. And that's actually the way to get, a rat in a Skinner's box pecking away like mad, is to have that variability there.
Yeah, so it's positive intermittent reinforcement. It's there's no sort of causal outcome. So therefore you repeat the behavior in the hope that eventually you will get that outcome.
Yeah, the unpredictability could be part of the draw. I think what Natty's saying actually about the hierarchy of needs is an interesting point. And maybe, if you think at the levels that the social media is going to work at, obviously there's the love and belonging level. Now it's a sad state of affairs if social media is a substitute for a real sense of love and belonging, but it could be acting like that. And the esteem thing is a really interesting one, because how do we build self-esteem? Well, validation from others would be one way, and it's a way to potentially get validation from huge numbers of other people. Those are interesting ideas. I think it's likely that there's going to be multiple reasons why it's so compelling, aren't there? So I don't think they're necessarily contradictory.
Yeah, I think the main basis is that whether we want to say we use social media just for communication, I think that we can safely say that we generally post from some kind of emotional position that seeks a response. So we're sending out an emotional kind of idea or question that we want getting respond to. And whether that response is a notification, a like, I think that's essentially what's driving the social media trend. Now, the point where it becomes slightly unhealthy is the addictive nature. So Harvard did a study that showed social media is like a substance addiction. So the reward area in the brain lights up when they are intaking this information. In this case, it's social media, but in other cases, it's an addictive substance. And basically, neurons in the principal dopamine producing areas get activated and cause the dopamine levels to rise. So therefore, the brain receives a reward and associates that reward, that feeling, with the scrolling. And I think we can safely say this is how. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so I think what you're getting onto is that it is by nature addictive. I mean, addiction by definition is chronic relapsing disorder characterized by compulsive behavior seeking pleasure despite harmful consequences. I mean, it is a compulsive behavior. A lot of people have to check social media or feel a compulsion to check social media every single day. And then also, we're constantly told with talks with school that it can be detrimental to our mental health, and yet we do this behavior anyway.
I think you've got some really interesting stuff here. So you're suggesting that being on social media sort of hijacks the dopamine reward system in much the same way that, you know, drug use would do that. What would be interesting to look at is, does all scrolling hijack the reward system in the same way, or is it particularly when there is some kind of social interaction going on? Because if you think about what the dopamine reward system, the type of behavior it's supposed to motivate are sort of basic survival behaviors for humans. So it's supposed to make it rewarding to eat, to drink, to have sex, and to form social connections, meaningful social connections with others. Is the social media such a powerful system for hijacking our dopamine reward system because it's sort of a type of social interaction? So it'd be interesting to compare just kind of scrolling without any actual sort of two-way interaction with another individual, see how addictive that is, or is it the sort of, you know, the Instagram posting thing where you're expecting something back? Is that what's most compelling? Is that what's really, you know, getting our dopamine reward system interested? So I think, you know, there's a lot of interesting research you could look at there, and because social media is such a very broad term, isn't it? It means lots of different things. It maybe needs to be pinned down a little bit. Just something I was thinking on your first point, why do we use it? It sort of reaches a point, doesn't it, where it feels like you just kind of have to use it because everybody's on it. So normal life becomes almost more difficult if you're not on it. So it's a bit like, you know, certainly for me, if I was to answer that question, maybe different from people your age, but I would probably say, well, I reluctantly use it because you seem to have to. Otherwise, how do you stay in touch with people? You know, we don't no longer.
Well, you don't have to use social media like Instagram, Facebook. There are messaging, FaceTime. There are other platforms you can use. You don't.
But would you not describe the other platforms as forms of social media? So your definition is, you know, someone that has you have an account and you post things about yourself. Is that? Yeah.
Yeah, but also you're not being advertised. So on WhatsApp, you're not being advertised to. That's how Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. That's how they make money. They're using you as a product to be sold.
So I suppose the thing from my point of view is it's just where most of my sort of extended social circle, who I wouldn't necessarily have a phone number for, they're in it. They're on it. So it's possible to look people up. And I wonder, maybe an interesting question, rather than why do people use it, would be why do people not use it? So, you know, what percentage of people of your age are not on any form of social media? It'd be interesting to look at why have they resisted, because there's going to be lots of reasons why people use it. you know, it's almost a kind of assumption that there's no alternative, I'd imagine, with your age group. But what do you know anyone who's not on any social media? My sister's not on any social media. She has no Facebook and nothing like that. She's always resisted it. And I think it's kind of, it's quite cool, really, just to be like, no, I'm not doing any of that.
But that might go into what sort of like, once people start, they cannot stop. Further going into why it might be these social media platforms are designed to make it more addictive. That kind of goes into there was a study in 2011, Maurizio Mori, hope I pronounced that right, but essentially took a sort of brain scanning of our EEG of like our neurons inside our brain, and they used a control variable of, they just said, okay, we're going to play some meditation, you're going to relax, we're just going to observe how your brain works. And then they contrasted that and said, okay, you can do whatever you want for 5 minutes. And usually when people went on their phone, they'd also measure that. And what they found was that people would be in a state of sort of equilibrium when using social media between anxiety and relaxation.
Right.
It's not so much to push you away, but it's not so little that your attention plummets.
So I mean,
go on, Natty.
It's just a bit like gambling. I mean, you know, gambling addictions. Josh, I know you mentioned this to me earlier, but you're in the slot machines. You never know what you're going to get, and I think that is what makes it so kind of addicting, because one time you'll get this validation, you'll get the likes, and one time you don't. So you pick up your phone again.
Which would explain why it's kind of in that state of equilibrium, like you're sitting on the precipice of sort of not extreme anxiety, but that adrenaline feeling, that feeling of exhilaration.
Yeah, I think you've got a few questions, haven't you, that are maybe slightly different questions. Just why do people start using it is a question. And then you've got why do some people, when they start, what are the vulnerabilities towards being drawn in and being somebody who uses it, you know, all the time? I mean, we've just been talking about N-affiliators, haven't we? And people who have a very, very high need for validation from others, are very susceptible to normative social influence. I wonder what their patterns of social media use are like, whether they're more vulnerable to addiction. And the answers will be different, don't they? Why do people start? Well, you can't start because it's rewarding.
Yeah.
You don't know that it's rewarding until you do it. And then, you know, what makes people keep doing it? And the interesting thing with social media is it is known, because there are algorithms that are designed to keep people using it. So the companies and the tech companies, they know why it's addictive. But they're not so keen to share their secrets with us. But it is known, it is programmed to be addictive, isn't it? Obviously, like Natty says, you know, there's the reward element of it. There's also the sort of creating your own world that happens around you without you knowing that you're doing it in social media. And there's the kind of, that puts you into groups of sort of people who the algorithms have decided are similar, and then there's a sense of group belonging that people can get from, you know, the constant validation of, you know, their own views, and by sort of saying how much they agree with other people, and also ostracizing people with different views. So people sort of form little camps on social media, don't they? And they'll sort of insult people with different views, which makes the people of the group that they're in, you know, sort of validate them, and they feel more part of that group. And there's, you know, a lot of that goes on social media. There's very little, from what I see, very little, certainly sort of political conversation between people with different views. It doesn't descend quickly into name calling, and you wonder, you know, why is this happening? And are people communicating in a way that's primarily for their own group? It's not about trying to persuade somebody who has a different view, because all they seem to do is insult people with different views. But by doing that, what they're saying to the group that they believe they're part of is, I'm one of you, accept me as one of your own. And they get that validation, and they feel, yeah, I'm really part of a group here, that means something to me. But it's polarizing in terms of, you know, different groups, and you seen that in politics, you know, certainly in America and certainly, you know, across Europe. It seems like there's less in the middle, and people are going further, you know, or people are reporting having less friends who have different political views, and, you know, I don't think that's a good thing.
Yeah, because it's because now the possibilities of social media like Facebook, Instagram, you can pay to put out an ad that will attract or be put in front of people that will be especially susceptible to the ad. So if you had someone who had some extreme views or some minor views leaning that way, and then said, okay, the algorithm then puts this in front of you, and you kind of go down the rabbit hole, as it were.
Yeah.
Just going a bit further away from that, because that's a huge topic, and it is just, I mean, there's loads of documentaries on it. We wanted to investigate the correlation between declining mental health and social media. And I think it's safe to assume everyone knows that this is happening. Why is it happening? You know, Josh, I know you did some research.
Yeah, I did. And sort of even before like Facebook came in, or Instagram and all of that, because that all started in 2004. In 1998, Kraut did a study, and they looked at declining rates of communication between family members and time spent on the internet. And it obviously, like, as people spend more time on the internet, they spend less time with people. But that doesn't really come into a huge significance until 2013. Cross then did a study, and it looked at how people responded to being on social media for like extended periods of time, and they'd send him messages, like 5 messages a day, about how they were feeling at different intervals in the day. And what he found was, as the day went on, they would become more and more I don't want to say saddened, but you get what I mean.
Frustrated.
Sort of, frustrated. Those negative emotions started coming out throughout the day. The more they started to use these sites, and that suggested a positive correlation between like using more social media and declining mental health.
Yeah.
Well, look, a couple of things I think you've got to be careful. Obviously, it's correlation. So correlation isn't causation. There are a couple of things that maybe suggest it's a little bit more than a correlation. So I believe there's a sharp spike in sort of, or you can track the point at which social media was available on smartphones. Sort of correlates with a fairly significant uptick in the number of cases of anxiety and depression type disorders in young people. So there are indications that this is maybe a bad thing, and there are reasons, you know, why to believe, you know, that the way it's working is not going to be good for people's mental health. But I would keep in mind that, you know, at the moment it's probably correlation. It's quite difficult to do a controlled study. It could be that people who, as people's mental health declines, they withdraw from the real world and move more into an online world, given that, you know, a lot of the most common mental health problems that affect young people are associated with a sort of a withdrawing from real social contact. So what may have before social media just been a withdrawing of contact might now be slightly being replaced by sort of appearing online somewhere. I think this is a fascinating, you know, natural experiment that's going on right now. And I certainly don't envy your generation in this way. There's lots of ways that I do, but in terms of your whole lives being on social media, I'm not sure whether it's necessarily something that I would have liked at your age. I think it's interesting, going back to Natty was talking about what humanistic psychologists might say about this. And I don't know whether this is sort of directly relevant to the current point, but, you know, we talk about actual self and ideal self.
Yeah.
It could be something if you're looking at this through sort of a humanist perspective, what you might suggest is going on is that people are sort of projecting an ideal self and living vicariously through an ideal self that's online and not real. And
Yeah,
then
they're kind of like,
actual self is this kind of like, oh, down in the real world, I'm my actual self. But it doesn't kind of matter because I'm my ideal self here. But in actual fact, that's not congruence. You know, it's sort of, there's a
no, it's kind of
fakeness.
going on about this like warped perception of reality, that kind of everything is perfect on social media. There's very little in the way of anything but perfection. People post the best way they look, the new job that is amazing for them. There's very little in the way of anything negative. So
of course, there are people who post about their negative mental health, and that forms a kind of group on social media, doesn't it? That actually some people might exaggerate their symptoms in order to get the sense of belonging within a community on social media that is focused around, you know, experiencing negative mental health. So there's good things and bad things there. You know, if these communities online, if they are genuinely providing support for people who are experiencing negative mental health, that's actually a really good thing. But you may find some people sort of accessing or becoming part of these communities because they enjoy the support, but they're not necessarily as ill. Yeah, they would sort of hit the threshold for you know, suffering with a mood disorder or an anxiety disorder.
But what I'm talking about is very rarely do you end up with someone going a definitive, I have this. It's always through the form of like reposting other people talking about their experiences, or something like, we need to think about how we treat ... It's never a definitive, I have a problem. So people have this perception that, oh, if everyone else is doing fine, then I should be coping. I should have to cope. When that's not simply the case.
Just a sidetracking, just to be annoying. I don't know if this happened to you, Josh, because you're a boy, and Peter, you joined social media a little later. But certainly for a girl, when you're an adolescent, self-esteem is obviously a huge issue, and a lot of social media is our identity. Now, something I have a problem with, and I reflect now to this day, is the sort of ads I was getting when I was 14 was about face editing apps. And I've heard people liposuction ads. Should we be,
Yeah, I mean that's pretty disturbing, isn't it? I think one of the things that I'm quite pleased about when I'm on social media is I don't think it knows me very well, because the ads that it sends me, it's like, what are you sending me that for? It's just this sort of, I can't see, they have this weird picture of who I am that doesn't really tie into the real me. So I feel like I've kind of got one up on them there a little bit, apart from occasionally they'll send you something that you feel like you've just been talking about to somebody.
Yeah.
Like, hang on, how does Facebook know I just had that conversation? You know, are they listening to me? But yeah, I think that's pretty disturbing, though, Natty. You know, and interesting how gender might play into that, and you know, the old gender stereotypes that, you know, the mainstream media, you know, got so much stick for perpetuating seem to have sort of translated straight over into social media there. If you're aiming liposuction at, you know, 14-year-old girls, that's you know, is that any better than, you know, in the 1950s where they're, you know, targeting, you know, young women with, you know, adverts for domestic products and that kind of thing? Probably not.
No, completely not. But talking about, especially for teenagers, why we might be more susceptible to this sort of like self-evaluation is because our medial prefrontal cortex, it kind of peaks at inactivity. This is the area of the brain where we kind of evaluate our, it's linked to where we make decisions, our frontal cortex as a whole. But it's mainly about how we relate to others, our place in these groups. And if we're throwing ads at teenagers where this is particularly active about, oh, this is how people look, or this is a desirable way for your body to look, and then people are especially prone to buying into this idea, should we then completely ban these adverts for children, simply putting a ban on certain material?
I think this leads to a really important question, and knowing what we know, is social media ultimately a burden or a good thing? And if it is a bad thing, should the law be more involved? Should parents be more involved? Should schools be? What are we going to do now, knowing what we know? I think is the big question to summarize it.
Some big questions there, Josh. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think I will talk, because schools are already involved.
Yeah.
I've gone to 3 schools, and all 3 schools have given me a talk on the dangers of social media and overusing social media. Yet I will be fully honest, I have not put this thing down since lockdown started. Every single day I'm upward of like 11 hours of screen time. It is absolutely ridiculous. Even though I've had these talks. So I don't think it's a problem with schools. By the time we're at school, it's so ingrained in us. It's already, that addictive behavior of wanting that has already happened. But in terms of the law, it's a little bit difficult. These companies they're not national. They're not government companies. And they're international. If we start putting restrictions on stuff like that, Germany tried to do it with certain speech and had a whole ordeal with, I think, Facebook, and that turned out to be a blunderbuss. They're having serious problems there. But it might be possible to say that for people who register under a certain age, might pre-18, before 18, we may be able to put a law into place to say, hang on, these adverts cannot be shown to these people because it is a significant risk to their mental health, considering their age.
Well, I think you're dead right. Really, I think it's difficult to control, isn't it? That's one of the problems. I think it's something that I'm very worried about, and I think because if you look at the trajectory of this, people are spending more and more time, and I think just virtual worlds I find a worrying thing. And you see over the last 20 years the amount of time that people are spending in these sort of worlds that aren't real, projecting versions of themselves that aren't real. It's more and more and more, and as technology gets better, we're going to become more integrated with it. How far down the line is it before your social media notifications are direct to your brain?
Oh God.
Or you just see them, because you've got a little chip or whatever. It sounds ridiculous, but I actually don't think it's probably as far away as we think. And as the power to simulate worlds becomes greater and greater and greater, the draw of the simulated world will become greater and greater and greater. And is this our demise as a species? Is this what we're going to do? We're going to get lost in a virtual world and lose any interest in the real world, because the real world is tough, and the real world can be dull at times. So once the simulations are as real as the real thing, why will we choose to be in the real thing? And I think it's so bigger than social media is, will we just eventually just choose to live in computers?
It's quite a way to end the podcast. I think what I'm gonna last say is only, and to the people listening, do you think there will be a time where you can live without social media? In my personal reflection, I don't think I could.
I think that's an interesting point, that, Natty. I think I could. I think something that I always sort of think about when I'm thinking about screens more generally, really, I suppose, and it's interesting this, because I've got a 3-year-old, and you see the draw of a screen. There's something strangely compulsive about it for young children and for all of us. And we know, I think young children are really compulsively looking at screens. Well, it's not just young children, it's humans are very drawn to screens. But I remember there's 2 times in my life where there was an extended period of time where there were no screens. Both times when either my family were moving or I was moving with my family, when I was about 8, we moved from the northeast to the northwest, and we lived in a caravan while we were self-building a house, and there was no TV. And that particular couple of months, I have very, very, very fond memories of. I thought it was amazing. I loved it, and there was no screens and no telly. And obviously, this is before computers. You know, well, not before computers, but there was no computer in the house. And then when Stacey and I moved out of London and we moved over to Bristol, for about 3 months we stayed in my parents' camper van in a campsite that's attached to a friend of mine's pub. And there was obviously no TV because there's no TV signal, but there was also no Wi-Fi, and it was because it was in the sticks. There was no Bluetooth on our phones. And our lives there were very, very simple because it was a very small way of living. There wasn't much sort of in the way of housework to do. And I have extremely fond memories of that. It sort of forces you to talk to each other and to do things that don't involve just taking the easy option, like turn the screen on and watch it. And I had a great time. You know, I really, really enjoyed it. And I think we were talking about this with Stacey. We were thinking, you know, maybe family holidays should be a time where there are no screens of any sort. So no internet other than maybe to find where something is. But no surfing the internet, no going on any kind of social media, no watching telly, no watching films. Going back to that kind of, and I can see you guys like, oh my God. But, you know, that's kind of how it just used to be when you were on holiday. There'd be no, you know, you wouldn't have a telly with you.
No, that's very interesting because if what we're talking about with sort of like I'd call it like mass addiction to a platform, that's very interesting. If people would be able to like put it aside for like a couple of weeks,
you'd be surprised how different it is. You'd be surprised how different it is if you unplug yourselves, you know, and go native. But it's you know, when I've been forced to do it, I've really, really enjoyed it. But doing it kind of yourself when you're not forced to is quite hard. Well, very hard. You know, and I suppose you have to, you know, your timeline. You've always been on the internet, have you? The internet has just always existed.
I have, yeah.
From being about like 5, 6, yeah, I had my own iPad. I could do what I wanted on it. I've always had that freedom of the internet.
Yeah, I can remember when it first came about. I was probably, I don't know, when it first came into our house, I was probably 14 or something. And I remember the first social media. I remember sort of people going on this thing called MySpace, which was it was really hard work. I never did it. It was, you know, you had to spend loads of time building your own little website. I couldn't get why would people do that, build a website about themselves, but now everybody does it. Anyway.
Well, I think we're going to leave it there. But the question I'm going to leave our listeners with is, do you think you can spend less time on social media? And if you can, why don't you challenge yourself for a bit? So we just want to say thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed. So thank you.